Hello, I'm Professor Congleton, and this is Econ 411, Moral Foundations of Capitalism. This lecture is being recorded because I'm going to be away the week after spring break, attending a conference in Europe. And rather than kind of leave out some material in order to let you all have a free day off, I thought I would record at least an introduction to the material we're going to be going into next. So we finished up the material on game theory and economic development, and we showed a bunch of things in that material, right? First, that trade is not automatic, okay? That you need something like transferable property rights. You need some kind of practices of trade, and in many cases you need some moral support for trade as an activity. And that moral support may help to overcome transactions costs. It may also help to overcome problems of fraud. It may also tend to make production more efficiently by increasing the productivity of team production. And all these things tend to improve the performance of markets, increase its ability to provide material comforts to people in the communities being served by those markets. So what we're going to do next is to kind of shift from the game theoretic point of view, these game matrices we've been using, where all the strategies are discrete and the outcomes are discrete, to an environment where those strategies are continuous and where the outcomes are continuous. Okay, that is, there won't be set 1, 2, 3 outcomes. There'll be a whole continuum of outcomes that are possible. And the advantage of doing this is first that it shows that those results we obtained by going through the discrete versions in game theory actually generalize to settings where strategies are continuous and outcomes are continuous. It also shows that you can bring these ideas from that part of the course into more or less conventional neoclassical economics without much work. Okay, so you might say, well, why were they ever left out? Well, the reasons were basically, A, it made the model simpler, right? You didn't have to talk about cultural or moral support for markets. You could just begin with whatever level of support there was and explore what kinds of results you'd expect from markets in those given circumstances. And second, by the time neoclassical economics had been worked out, and it was worked out mostly to think about Western commercial societies as they emerged in the late 19th century, early 20th century, those norms could be taken for granted. There was a good deal of ethical and normative support for markets by that time, as was evidenced in the first part of the course where we kind of went through some philosophical stories about how, about the proper role for ethics in a good life, in a good society. And we found that, generally speaking, that support was increasing and deepening over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries. So when I provide things on the whiteboard here, I will not be stopping to let you have time to kind of copy things down. So be sure to hit pause and take notes more or less like you would for a normal lecture. So the video will be much shorter than the lecture in class, in part because I don't provide those gaps for you to jot down notes. And because you aren't visibly here, at least to me, I won't be looking around and trying to see your reactions to material. I'll just be guessing that whatever I'm covering is reasonably clear and that I haven't made too many stumbles here in the recording. Okay, so let's move on to an example. So I want to think of an example, think of a case where there are two levels of quality for some good. And I'm going to start by assuming that if you have a high quality level, that's the MBH, your marginal benefits from units of that good are naturally higher than they would be if you have a more inferior quality of the good, MBL. right? And so marginal benefits are just the extra benefits you get from an extra unit of consumption. And they're measured in dollars normally, so you can keep everything in currency terms and think and move from these sorts of diagrams directly over to market type diagrams about demand and supply and price determination. You could also write them down in marginal utility terms, but then you wouldn't be able to make the switch quite so easily. Same logic applies in both cases, but this is a more straightforward, these sorts of diagrams are more easily kind of connected up with the usual microeconomic diagrams that we use in undergraduate courses. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to think about is, well, suppose that there's some random component to production. And so sometimes there are good products and sometimes there are bad products produced by the same assembly line. And I'm going to assume that this is really an accidental process for most of this lecture. If you think back to the lecture on fraud, if this were intentional and consumers would not be able to figure out the difference, then a kind of a pragmatic firm might adjust the production process to produce a certain amount of defective units if they're cheaper to produce than the higher quality units, with the idea of maximizing expected profits. But we're not going to assume that at all. We're going to assume this is just an accident of the process of production, and that merchants are basically honest, and they have bad luck, and that bad luck spills over to their customers when they buy a defective unit. So the probability of the low quality or high quality influences the expected value of the product, right? So the expected value would be something like this, right? You have VE expected value. It's going to be P, the probability of a defective unit, plus 1 minus P times the value of a high quality unit. Okay, where P is the probability of a defect. And P is always between 0 and 1. So it turns out that the marginal benefits associated with this sort of situation always lies somewhere in between these two curves. And where exactly it lies depends on the probabilities. If the probabilities are 0.5 for each, right? So if P is 0.5, then 1 minus P will also be 0.5. Then the line is in the dead center between those two marginal benefit curves. And that's what we'll assume just to make the diagram easier. So that's the expected marginal benefit, and it's the marginal benefit that will influence consumer choices when they shop for this particular kind of product at these kinds of merchants. And just to suppose there's some prevailing price for this stuff in the overall market, and in that case, the consumer will purchase this amount right here, right? The place where the price line or the marginal cost line intersects that expected marginal benefit curve. That's true if the person's risk averse. If they're risk neutral, if they're risk averse, they'll actually buy a bit less than that. If they're risk preferring, they'll buy a bit more than that. But basically, you can use this analysis most easily when you think about risk neutral people who are just maximizing expected net benefits. And so we use that just to kind of keep the lecture easy and not have to worry about how risk averse or how risk preferring a particular consumer might be. Now, this probability is a function of things, right? There are things that determine the probability of a defect. Some of it is just the capital goods used, the production process, the management, you might say. But there are also the ethics, you might say the diligence, workforce. So in other words, how hard do people work to try to make sure that they get the good result rather than the bad results? Now, if you think about that, um, the more diligent they are, the lower the probability of a defect, and the closer this dotted line will be to this upper bound, to the marginal benefit H curve. But initially, just imagine that firms are not paying attention to this. They just assume all workers are the same, more or less as assumed in most neoclassical textbooks. Like a principles textbook or an intermediate micro textbook, or even a graduate school textbook. And so basically, they don't pay any attention to differences in the diligence, differences in this kind of work ethic that their employees might have, and therefore this characteristic of the workforce is distributed randomly among the firms. Okay, so some will have an unfortunate workforce where there are lots of pragmatists and not very many diligent folks, and they will tend to produce more closely to the lower line, the MBL curve. Other firms will get lucky, and they will have a more diligent than average workforce. Just because when you draw labor out of the hat, so to speak, the average result will be this one, the initial one we just started with. But sometimes you get lucky, right? And you get a better than average draw, and other times you get unlucky and you get a worse than average draw. So imagine that we have you might think it was the lucky guys over here. And over here, you have the unlucky. Well, notice that if consumers can figure this out, they're going to sell different quantities of goods. And notice that this happens in this model as far as we've talked about it so far, surely from chance. Right? There's no effort to kind of be clever and hire diligent people or avoid hiring non-diligent people. They're just basically trying to produce the stuff and just more or less grabbing labor as it turns up, more or less like pulling it out of a hat. Okay, so which one of these firms is going to be more profitable? Well, if you're selling more stuff, other things being equal, you're likely to be more profitable, right? As long as you're making, say, imagine a more or less horizontal marginal cost curve to make life easy, then the firms that sell more will have more profits automatically. If there's an upward sloping marginal cost curve, it's a little trickier. It would depend to some extent. But firms will never kind of produce more than maximizes their profits. And so you wouldn't see outcomes out in this direction if it was too expensive to serve serve that market and fulfill the demands of the consumers that are interested in shopping at your place. So generally speaking, I think as a rule of thumb, you're going to expect that the lucky firms are more profitable than the unlucky firms insofar as consumers can tell them apart. So once this pattern starts to materialize, it's clear that firms may well start thinking about what is it that makes these guys more profitable than we are back here if you're the unlucky firm. And you might speculate, well, maybe it's their location, maybe it's there's some other benefit. Maybe they have a clever sign, better signage, a better message. Somehow that it's not attributed to the difference that really matters here, diligence. And they just fumble around and do different things, and they still can't close the gap. Well, eventually they may figure out that, well, maybe it's differences in the diligence of the workforce. And when they do, then you can see that there will be kind of differences in the demand for different types of people, right? So if you can, as long as the wage is the same, you will try to hire more diligent people and avoid hiring the less diligent people. Now, if you think about that a bit, in our normal neoclassical way, we're going to have a demand for low quality workers, and there'll be some kind of supply, and there'll be some kind of demand for high quality workers, and there'll be some kind of supply. And it's not likely that the wage that clears one market will be the same as the other. Now, which result turns up will depend partly on the location of the demand curves. So DH is going to be greater than DL because the marginal product of the high quality diligent people is higher than the marginal marginal product of the low quality people, and demand just this the prevailing price of the good times the marginal product of the person type that you're trying to attract, right? It's just D equals PL, the price of the output, times H. Okay, so if the prices were the same in both markets, it's clear this demand curve would be higher, and unless the supply curve is really way back or way out, these guys are just completely commonplace, in which case you might not hire any of these guys. Okay. On the other hand, if these are a little bit scarce, maybe a little bit more scarce than the low quality guys, then the normal result is going to be wages in the high quality labor pool is going to be higher than the wages in the low quality labor pool once this difference is recognized. Okay. So at that point we just kind of reasoned to intuitively last time. But notice that in this case we can kind of reason to it a little bit more directly by thinking about what the demand for labor looks like. Maybe we should remind ourselves of what we've got on the two diagrams by labeling the axes is always a good idea. And the difference may not be enormous, okay, but it will be non-trivial, right? I would predict enough to notice. Now, if you think back to the original diagram, let's just reconstruct it. If we think about this market clearing, it's quite possible that we'll have a stable equilibrium here, okay? And what I want to think about is, suppose there's a kind of exogenous shock, okay, that alters the average diligence of the labor force. Right? If it goes up, then there's kind of a shift in the marginal expected benefit curve. And that shock will do what? It will cause output to increase. And as output increases, specialization tends to increase. And real wages tend to rise. Right, so we're not showing that yet, okay, but I wanted to kind of remind you of the kind of connectedness of markets and how we'd expect markets to respond to this kind of shock. So if you remember, Max Weber argued that the Protestant Reformation tended to put capitalism in motion, and it did so in his view because it increased the average propensity to work, okay, basically work hard and diligently, and also tended to increase savings rates. And what I've done in this diagram is make the argument that, well, if diligence improves the average quality of the products, then more of those products will be sold, okay, to typical consumers. As more of those products are sold, specialization tends to increase, and the production costs tend to fall. They fall both because of the diligence and also because of the increase in the specialization that takes place. And as a consequence, you kind of get two positive effects just out of the work ethic effects. And then on top of that, if you have increased savings and an increased supply of capital, then firms can take advantage of more roundabout methods of production. They can use more equipment in their production process, have more specialized tools for their workforce, and enhance productivity in that way as well. So that would give us three drivers of expanded economic development. And as far as I remember, Max Weber doesn't articulate all three, but basically points in the direction that is what he thought happened. Okay. Now, the other thing that happened in Weber's idea is that workers on average became, through time, more and more driven by their normative attitudes towards work. The idea that there's a kind of a duty to work effectively and diligently, when you're on the job. And as those ideas kind of became more commonplace in the workforce, then naturally this green dotted line would keep shifting out towards the higher quality, lower defective type of production, and you're going to get more and more of these kind of nice results out of the system. So the neoclassical economics that was more or less worked out at the time that Weber was writing, but which he wasn't necessarily aware of because mostly it was done in the English-speaking part of the world rather than the German-speaking part of the world at that time. It certainly lends support to his hypothesis if you think through it. So with that introduction to the material and how you can bridge the game theoretic material and the standard neoclassical tools that we use in class all the time, I'll stop here. And I'll be back after the week after spring break, okay, the week after, I guess. So do take a look at this set of lecture notes, and also take a look at the chapter on neoclassical economics, which is chapter 4 in the book. And I'll see you when I get back in a couple of weeks. Take care. Bye.